Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome you all and thank everyone for participating in the second edition of the Spring School in International Politics and Security organized by the University of Padua. So I'm glad to introduce Professor Alessandro Paccagnella, who is the Vice Rector of the University of Padua for the International Relations, for the welcome remarks. So Professor Paccagnella, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Professor Lomellini. Good morning to everybody, and welcome to this edition of the school. And let me congratulate, first of all, colleagues of the Department of Political Science, Law, International Studies for organization of such a timely event, I would say, as we are trying to come out from the crisis due to COVID-19. I would like also to thank all participants and speakers, very distinguished speakers, first of all, Professor Mogherini, and all students who are going to follow and take lectures during this week. And as I said, it's a timely school as we have faced such a huge international crisis. This reminds me of what happened in our university. As you know, we are going to celebrate 8 centuries of academic life next year. And thinking of what happened during these 8 centuries of academic life, I think that we have our ancestors, our previous colleagues and students had to face many crises and many problems. And during the centuries, they were typically plagues and wars and famine. And I remember what I was reading about the chronicles of the 16th and 17th century about the plagues. And the students who were going to prepare for their final dissertation, at a certain point, the anonymous writer, reports that they were not so good and they felt ill. And eventually they passed away. Plague was mystery. Nobody knew how to face why it came and how it could be solved. These days, we have been able to face these problems, these issues, thanks to research, thanks to preparation, thanks to science. And this is a great lecture for the future and for the present times as well. We have to rely on science to face the challenges and problems and issues which we can find anytime in our very complex world. And this is true. Also, if we look back at the meaning of crisis, crisis comes from the ancient Greek crisis. Crisis has not a negative nuance. It just tells you have to make a choice. You have to separate. You have to take a decision. And what's the best way to take a decision? Learning, studying, and knowing more. And in this sense, university and all universities around the world have to support the decisions that our political bodies, scientific bodies, industrial bodies, the society at large have to take. And in this way, I think that what we're going to give is a very large overview of the possibilities of it that arise due to crises around the world. And I hope and I wish that this week will be fruitful to all participants. I'm sure that they will learn a lot, and it's only a pity that they cannot exchange directly their experience. But we hope that in the next future, this will be possible, starting possibly next year. Then we hope that everything could be done in presence eventually. So with this wish and with this grateful acknowledgement of the work which has been done, that will be done for this school, I wish to all of you a very successful and pleasant participation to this call. Take care.
Thank you so much to Professor Pacagnella for this warm welcome. And I immediately leave the floor to Professor Enela Pariotti, Director of the Department in Political Science, Law and International Relations of the University of Padua.
Good morning to everybody. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies, I'm very glad to welcome you to the Spring School on International Politics and Security. It is an important achievement for the department, and it is part of an increasing involvement into a series of initiatives ranging from research to teaching to public engagement. Just to mention some of them, one of the master degrees that are managed by the department, which is in theory taught in English, the master degree in European and Global Studies, has just activated a specific track which is devoted to global social policies and security issues, and which includes subjects such as global social policy and human security, terrorism and security in international history, democratic transitions in central and history of conflicts, transnational security, cooperation policies in Euro-Mediterranean area, violent extremisms, and organized crime in historical perspective. So just to mention one initiative in the field of research, the department participates in an important network at the European level to promote cooperation in this field. And it seems to me that the multidisciplinarity that is promoted within the department is supposed to create a suitable environment to tackle this field of research and teaching. This second edition of the Spring School, dealing with crisis management and crisis impact over national and international systems, is highly promising in terms of the amount of participants and in terms of distinguishing of speakers. So let me warmly thank all the participants and the distinguished speakers, starting from Francesca Mogherini and all the speakers involved in this intensive week. And let me wish you a fruitful work. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Pariotti. And before introducing Rector Mogherini, I would like to share some details on the Spring School. So IPSe has been founded and led by the University of Padua and is based on a network of 11 partner universities. Among those, we can list the College of Europe, the Humboldt Universität, Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University, St. Andrews University, Saint-Cyr Research Center and Saint-Cyr French Army Academy, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the Observatory on the Organized Crime from the University of Milan, the PhD program in Humanities of the University of Urbino, and the University of Genova. So for this year's edition, I'm glad to say that we have received more than 70 applications from universities from the United Kingdom, Austria, Russia, France, Switzerland, Mexico, India, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Nigeria, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, and several also Italian universities from Milan to Padova and from Rome to Turin. So for this edition, given our attention to both history and current affairs, the topic of this second edition is then the crisis management and the crisis impact over national and international systems. So during the week, we will cope with topics such as health crisis and state responses from the Middle Age pandemic, as Professor Pacagnella anticipated, to current day one, so such as COVID-19, of course, potential threat to the national political system like populism, but also other kind of threats like terrorism, migration management, and policies in response to these global challenges. So one of the key political actors to be considered is obviously the European Union, and I'm very glad that Director Federica Mogherini accepted our invitation to give a keynote speech on the EU and crisis management. So I will very briefly introduce Rector Mogherini, who is actually the rector of the College of Europe since September 2020. She also co-chairs the United Nations high-level panel on internal displacement. Previously, as everybody knows, she has served as High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and was also Vice President of the European Commission from 2014 to 2019. Prior to joining to the EU, she was the Italian Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and member of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. In her parliamentary capacity, among many tasks, she was also the head of the Italian Delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and Vice President of its Political Committee, and she also coordinated the Interparliamentary Group for Development Cooperation. Federica Mogherini is also a fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School. She's member of the group of eminent persons of the Preparatory Commission for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, member of the European Leadership Network for Multilateral Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and last but not least, a member of the Board of Directors of the Italian Institute for Foreign Affairs. So I'm very glad to meet you, Rector Mogherini, even we did not have the chance to meet in person, but I'm very glad that you accepted our invitation, and I leave you immediately the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be opening this school, the spring school, this year. And I'm very honored to do this in partnership with this network, and most importantly to me, with the University of Padova. The only regret is not being able to be physically there in that beautiful city. And I take the words of Professor Pattagnella as an open invitation for the future, because Padova is in my heart for many reasons, and I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to visit you there and welcome you in Bruges in the near future, where I'm now, as you said, Director of the College of Europe. I found it very interesting, the topic that you've chosen this year, and I was looking at the program that the students are going to follow during these days, because indeed crisis management and the impact of crisis on national and international systems can be seen through lenses that are very different one from the other. And in fact, I've seen that you're going to focus on different aspects of the meaning of crisis. Even if personally, I would agree very much with Professor Pattagnella, the etymology of the word crisis is something we should never lose sight of, because indeed, today we have a negative assumption of the meaning of crisis, but there is some wisdom in the saying that every crisis is an opportunity, and that is rooting back to the Greek etymology of the term. And indeed, crisis is a choice, is a moment of change somehow that can turn into something bad or something good, but is neutral in itself. And I think this is really an interesting starting point if you look at the different issues you're going to look at during these days. On one side, you have obviously the challenges and the threats related to security, and this is the traditional way in which we interpret crisis. And this is also, I'm going first to have a little bit of a look at the different aspects of a crisis, but then also focus a little bit more on the instruments the European Union has and has put in place to respond or to manage these different aspects of the crisis. So as a traditional security-related interpretation of a crisis, the threat, the military dimension, the defense-related actions, crisis is very often put together with conflicts and sometimes even defines an early stage or a later stage of a conflict as in a continuum of what is perceived as a threat to security, to a community, or a nation state, or the international community at large. And here I see that you're going to address the issue of terrorism, and in particular, 20 years after 9/11, how the world has responded or not to that, how it has managed or not that crisis, that aspect of the crisis. But then indeed, there are several other domains in which the concept of crisis can be applied. Not far away in time, not long ago, we were facing in Europe, but also worldwide, a major and dramatic financial crisis that was hitting hard Europe, but not only Europe. And that at that moment, if you mentioned the word crisis, it was immediately evident and self-evident for all public opinions in the world that you were referring to the financial crisis. And that highlighted the fact that indeed you can have, it's not new in history, obviously, but this is new in our most recent history, for sure after the Second World War, that the world and Europe and nation states and communities need also some instruments for crisis management in the financial and economic field and sector, which is probably less of a focus for your Department of Studies, but it is for sure an element that is very well clear in the global public opinion perception and awareness. And then most recently in these days, we have this month, this year and a half, we have clearly identified how the crisis related to the health situation and the pandemic is the pressing priority today. Again, not something new in history, as you're also going to look into these days with several precedents, but as Professor Papagnella mentioned, with one main difference today. I would say two main differences today. The first one is a negative one, and that is the spread of the pandemic that goes global because the connections are global today compared to the past, where pandemics could have been mastered in relatively more geographically closed environments. This is not possible anymore in the world today. So a pandemic becomes global immediately, as well as the financial crisis became global immediately, and as well as security threats becomes global immediately. So all crises, this would be my first element, all crises in the world of today move immediately from a local or national dimension to an international and global dimension. There's no crisis that can stay local or regional. Its impact, whether it's a crisis related to security, whether it's a crisis related to financial and economic situation, or whether it's a crisis related to the health situation, goes global, no matter what we think we can do to prevent this from happening. And the second difference we're facing in the pandemic today, in the health crisis today, that was not the case for the pandemics and the health crisis in the past, as Professor Papagnella mentioned, is the fact that today we have a development of science and research that brings us to a different level. And this is indeed highlighting the first lesson that I think we should learn. I would say two lessons we should learn, especially in Europe. First is the value of research and academia and the need to invest consistently and coherently, and not only in times of crisis, but also in times when the crisis is not acute, to support, including financially, research and university work. And the second is the importance of a public health sector, which is predominantly a European model that has been put in question from time to time in the past years, especially in connection with the impact of the financial crisis. But then I think has been dramatically reminded to us all how important it is to invest consistently and steadily into public health services in times of non-crisis, because this allows us to be prepared for when the crisis comes. I'm afraid that we will have to face a fourth element, a fourth dimension of crisis globally, together with the security-related one, the financial and economic-related one, the health-related one. I think that the next big crisis that will hit the world will be the climate change-related one. and the environmental crisis that is already with us. We see it every day in different parts of the world. We see the connections between this dimension of the world crisis and the pandemics. But I think that this is somehow something that will stay with us for some time, and to which I believe the world of academia and research can contribute enormously to try and manage the crisis. Again, I think the title of this spring school is very appropriate, because you not only consider the impacts, you consider the management. And I think what we can do, knowing the impact and the potential impact, studying the potential impact, is to develop instruments to manage the effects of this impact on societies and on national and international communities. Now, coming to the European Union, traditionally and well, historically, the competences of the European Union on crisis management have been boosted and developed enormously with the Lisbon Treaty. And that has been developed mainly in the field of the first pillar I mentioned related to the crisis, security and defense, external action, foreign policy. And if you have an initial research, a very superficial research about the EU and crisis management, the first thing you find is what is normally intended as EU crisis management, even today, which is a very relevant part of the European Union work. It has been basically the work I have been leading for the 5 years as High Representative, and that is the civilian and military aspect of the crisis response of the European Union. This pillar in particular, I think, is a very precious one for the global community, because the European Union has a toolkit that no other player in the world has. It mixes military means. Let me remind us all that the European Union has several military operations around the world, many of them under UN mandate and reporting back to the UN Security Council. Some others, in any case, always invited by the host country, and in many cases are dealing exactly with how to manage the crisis with a sense of ownership from the local communities and the national authorities. Many of them are training missions, many of them training missions that include not only technical aspects of military and defense, but also human rights related issues, how to manage a crisis respecting and promoting human rights, which is not something that every player in the world promotes, but the European Union does in difficult circumstances, and often in partnership with international NGOs and UN agencies, which I believe is an asset in itself. And then there's a lot of also maritime security that the European Union does. Let me just mention probably the most successful EU military operation in history, that has been Operation Atalanta of the Horn of Africa, dealing with piracy, and in a very successful manner. I highlight a couple of good stories because we always have our attention focused on what doesn't work, and we tend to give it for granted or forgot what actually works in practice. So the European Union has this military part of the toolbox in crisis management, but also has the civilian part of it. And here I think in particular to the civilian missions that the European Union has in different parts of the world that focus on the civilian part of the security sector reform or support. I think of the rule of law mechanisms, the judicial systems, the police. Let me mention one, for me, remarkable experience that the European Union has supported. I know that you're going to focus these days also on, as I said, the 20 years of 2011, and I imagine that the issue of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan would come up. Well, the European Union has never engaged in military operations in Afghanistan, but for instance, has trained police in Afghanistan for many long years, and with a particular focus to women in police forces in Afghanistan, which to me was a key element of building the security structure and together the democratic and resilient structure of the country, something that is going to stay. Or the judicial reforms, think of the Balkans, think of Iraq, many different other aspects where the civilian and the military aspects of security management and crisis management sometimes integrate each other and complement each other. So you would not find any other player in the world that has this mix of competences and tools that can apply to crisis management on the ground. And together with that, actually, I think that the European Union has one asset that nobody else has, and that is the fact that together with the military and civilian component of crisis management, the European Union has the capacity and the possibility to apply other policies to crisis prevention, conflict prevention, and the reconciliation process after a crisis has finished, hopefully. The implementation of agreements, the reconciliation of local communities, the incentivization, for instance, of transitioning of some, for instance, terrorist groups or former combatants into civilian life. I think of the conflict in Colombia and how the European Union has supported and still supporting the transitioning of the FARC from the combatant activities to agriculture, for instance. That is based on the history of the European Union, I would say, on the experience we all have. In most European countries, we have, if not all, actually, European countries, we have our own memory, our own tradition, our whole history of a transition from a war situation to a democracy situation, sometimes from authoritarian regimes to democracies. And in some cases, even recently, we have managed to handle reunifications and peace negotiations inside Europe. I think this gives us an asset and also an understanding of the complexity of crisis situations that helps us manage that. So what the European Union has is on the security part of the crisis management, not only the military and the civilian aspects, but also all the other instruments that can be utilized in coordination in what is called the integrated approach to crisis prevention, management, and to reconciliation. I think, for instance, of the use that the European Union can do and does of science in crisis prevention. There is a fascinating story I would share with you. A few years ago, the European Union organized a symposium on, I think it was physics research, so in the scientific fields, in the applied science. And that was happening in the Middle East. And there were scientists coming together, promoted and invited by the European Union, coming at the same time from Iran, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and you name it. People that would have not met otherwise, but through science and academia found a common ground. And I am sure that, again, this probably has not in itself solved a crisis or prevented a crisis, but has contributed to humanize the interlocutor. And this is the first step you have to do to prevent a crisis or to manage a crisis, to realize that on the other side, you don't have a flag, you have a human being, you have a person, you have a community of individuals. The same goes with the use of trade or economic projects to develop some initiatives that can help preventing a crisis or managing a crisis. Or again, on the economic, but also on the digital sector, on transport, on energy, plenty of other policies that the European Union can put in place in specific contexts to incentivize a solution of a crisis, a reconciliation process, the implementation of a peace agreement, or the prevention of a crisis. And I think that's, again, this unique mix of tools that go from trade to digital, from transport to energy, can indeed be very successful in some particular situations. And again, you wouldn't find any other player in the world that has the availability of mobilizing so many different policies in a coordinated manner. And the reason why the High Representative is also Vice President of the Commission is exactly this, that as a High Representative, he or she can mobilize and work on the security, defense, and foreign policy instruments. But as Vice President of the Commission, he or she can activate all the other policies of the European Union, the sectoral ones, again, all those that I mentioned before and more, to make sure that the two sides, the external action and the internal policies projected on an external action, find coherence and synergy and have a multiplied effect somehow. But let me also say that I believe that the European Union, apart from having an impressive toolkit on crisis management in the traditional sense of its meaning, security and defense-related one, also has a potential to tackle, or at least to contribute globally to tackle the other forms of crisis we are experiencing more and more today. On the economic and financial side, we have seen the European Union, let me say, struggling a bit with the recent economic and financial crisis, but I think the lesson was learned because, well, first of all, it took a while, but at the end of the day, it was solved. But most importantly, I believe the lesson was learned because when COVID became clearly an issue of relevance and urgency for all the European Union countries, the European Union managed to put in place a recovery plan that was unexpectedly impressive, relatively fast, that is mobilizing in a completely different manner than before resources, European resources, in a preventive manner to address the impact, the economic and financial impacts of a sanitary crisis in a preventive manner. And I think this is really something quite historic that goes also beyond the competences that the treaty gives to the in this case, the European institutions have gone beyond the boundaries of their own responsibilities to take steps proactively, both on the economic side of the recovery, but also on the health-related one. And here, I would say that the European Union, I think, is proving to test its capacity to have crisis management tools also on the sanitary field. Now, this is, I think, extremely, is something that we need to look at with some elements of cautious, because as you know, the European Union doesn't have competences on health. This is for national member states. And yet, we have seen in the last year, the European Union taking steps, and even now, on a sector on which it doesn't have competences deriving from the treaties. It could have been easier probably for the European leaders to leave it to member states and then blame member states if it didn't go well. Something that member states do often with the European Union institutions. Leave the responsibility to that level and then complain if it doesn't work. I think it was courageous and right that the European Union institutions took responsibility, even going beyond their competences, their treaty competences. And I think that it is clear to everybody that not only it is clear to everybody that looks at it honestly, let's put it this way, with a honest intellectual approach, that in a very difficult situation, both in terms of health measures, health assistance, and vaccines policy, it has been bumpy and difficult and far from perfect, also because of the magnitude, I believe, of the situation that was completely new to the entire world. But if you look at the reality of facts, my personal impression is that no member state alone could have done better without the European Union umbrella accompanying us somehow in the management of this sanitary crisis. So I think here, this is a field where the European Union is testing the ground for what kind of instruments and policies it can put in place to manage the sanitary crisis, which is something that it never did before. And it probably will have to do in the future, because I have the impression that even if we will manage to manage COVID now, and hopefully, I agree, have more of a normal year next year, we are in the College of Europe now very excited because we are doing the exams in presence, which is something that we were not expecting to be able to do just a few months ago. Extremely complicated, a crisis management in itself, I have to say, from the management point of view. So I would have expectations that next year we will manage to have also classes and lessons completely in person. So I agree that we will have, hopefully we will have a more normal year ahead of us. But personally, I wouldn't give it for granted that this is the last pandemic we're going to face for the next century. we might face other situations of similar kind that we will learn, I think, over and over to manage better and better, developing science and also developing policy. So we are in a phase where the European institutions, together with member states and together with the rest of the global community, are testing the waters, are trying to explore what kind of instruments can be put in place on the European level to manage this crisis at best. And then I was mentioning the 4 pillars I see of which crises apply to the world today: security and security-related ones, economic and financial related ones, health-related ones, and then finally, the next big challenge, I believe, will be the climate change-related crisis management we will have to do. And here, I believe the European Union really has probably the best assets it can use. I believe the European Union has the possibility of leading and continuing to lead today, together with the United States, luckily, which was not the case in previous years, the global response to the management of this crisis that I think is going to be probably one of the most dramatic we'll have to face in our generation. I'll stop it here because I think I've been probably even too long. Looking forward to questions and comments if time allows. And again, I would like to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to interact this morning, even if only virtually, unfortunately. And looking forward to continuing this cooperation in this network, Professor Pariotti, which is, I think, also extremely useful for all the universities participating in that.
Well, thank you very much to Rector Mogherini for this inspiring speech. And I would like to break the ice before leaving the ground to the discussion for students, just making some comments on what you said. I found your speech very, very interesting indeed on several points of view. And I would like to make some comments, especially dealing with three points. So first point, I mean, you spend a lot of time talking about that, but I think that we can we could, go ahead in this direction because this is very interesting indeed. So for the memory and the awareness of crisis. So a couple of days ago at the Global Health Summit, the Secretary General asked for a global coordinated effort on vaccines to end this pandemic, and ask also G20 countries, obviously in collaboration with the United Nations, to assume a strong leadership role. So, as you mentioned, we are in front of a global threat, and we do need a global leadership to cope with this. But actually, as far as I'm an historian, so this is my field of research more or less, so global threats are not new in history, and also attempts to coordinate are not new at all. Just bringing a couple of examples. I mean, at the end of the 20th century, terrorism threats led to a global response, for example, and at the beginning of the same century, the Spanish flu, so a health threat, posed the same problem. So the point is, what have we learned from that? So it's not a matter of predictability of the unpredictable. It is, as you said, crisis prevention. So usually leaders and public opinion are used to forgetting this need once that the threat seems to be over. So there is no memory at all, no lessons learned from history. So what do you think? Do you think that governments, EU and the public opinion are ready to remember these efforts once that, luckily and hopefully, we will turn off the light over the pandemic? So this is the first point I would like to make. The second one deals with the EU, the management of COVID and Brexit. Because as we said, we do need a global response, and Brexit to a certain extent represent a kind of vulnus in the European side of this story. However, we should also cope with the fact that the UK was very effective in managing the vaccination campaign, while the EU at the very beginning seems to show some uncertainties. So I wonder, what do you think, if you think that in answering the global crisis, the empty space left by the UK will affect negatively the EU response with that regard?
Let me start with this second question first. First of all, the management of the vaccine response obviously has been very much influenced by the location of the production of the vaccines. This has played a role, obviously, in the way in which different countries have managed to have access in a priority way or in a solid way to high number of doses. But having said that, I believe that, again, as I said, the European Union, as often happens, has learned by doing during the crisis. Because, as I said, it was not a competence for the European Union. There was no expectation for the European Union to act as a vaccine provider. And yet it did. And I think it did in a way that, obviously, as you said, it was at the beginning a bit confused, which is, I think, only normal in the moment when you do it at such a large scale, continental scale, without a protocol of practice established. Because it was the first time it happened, and it was not foreseen by anyone, and by no treaty, and by no policy that the European Union would have done that. So it was really learning by doing in the middle of the crisis. And yet, I think that most, if not all, member states would have done much worse without the European Union in terms of vaccination. That is my assumption. I cannot imagine what kind of fight we would have started and competition, and what kind of geopolitical use of the vaccines other players would have played over European countries if we didn't do it European Union-wise. So I think it was the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, I think it was also quite effective. I mean, we're seeing today that, yes, the UK vaccinated very fast, but we're seeing today that other European countries are also going very fast. I think that I think that Italy is now catching up quite well and quite fast. I can speak for myself. I'm 47, and today I'm getting my second dose of Pfizer in Brussels, which is quite remarkable because we only started in January somehow. So if you look at from zooming out a little bit after 1 year, we have a vaccine available. We have probably an issue of convincing large parts of the population, especially the older or more fragile groups, to be vaccinated and feel safe. But I think the global response, thanks also to the scientific community, has been quite good. And I think the European Union was brave in taking that responsibility, because again, once you take a responsibility, then the failure is yours. But I think it acted well. On the memory, on the collective memory, I think this is a very good point. And indeed, the biggest mistake we can do is to turn the page and think that once a crisis is over, it's over and we move on as before. And this applies to all sectors. It applies to finance and economy. It applies to security and defense. It applies to the sanitary situation. And I think that there is something in the past, we often did that mistake as human beings, as humankind. Often we turn the page thinking that we are going back to before. While after a crisis, there's never life as before. A crisis always leaves traces and changes that are deep and that stay. And I think, well, even in the daily behavior of individuals, this, I think, is something that is interesting to study. Now, in political science, we focus on communities and if not on international or national players, but if you look at the individual behaviors and how individual behaviors are affected by crisis, even after, long time after the crisis is over, I think this is going to be interesting. And for sure, it would be interesting to study for instance, how the combination of different crises will affect the behavior of a generation. I give you an example. The generation that is today in the late teenager time, let's say 15, 20 years old, have experienced in 5 years, when they were from 10 to 15, more or less, the terrorist crisis on their soil in Europe, for instance, and the pandemic. Both telling to the individual, the other is the danger. What kind of effect on societies and communities and individuals will that message in that early age have 20 years from now? What kinds of interpersonal or societal behaviors will a generation like that is afraid of the other, that identifies the other as a vital threat to their own life, develop societal communities links? I think that this is, for instance, something to be studied. But your question is going deeper than that. It's not so much related to the individual behavioral change that crisis leaves. I think that there, the memory of the individual possibly stays, depending on how much the individual is exposed to the crisis, how much he or she has lived the crisis on herself or himself. But what kind of collective memory do we retain on a national or international level? What kind of memory we cultivate somehow, we nourish? I believe there is a fundamental difference here today compared to the past. And that is the fact that in previous centuries, we didn't have international organizations and regional organizations. We only had, in the best of cases, national states or more fragmented political entities and institutional entities. And the smaller, I don't have scientific evidence of that, but I have a sort of empirical experience about that. The smallest an institution is, the quicker the institutional memory goes away, because the turnover of individuals is faster, and because the collective memory in itself is smaller. And so I believe that the existence today, contrary to the past centuries, of international organizations, think of the United Nations and its agencies, the European Union, other regional organizations that by definition work on the consolidation of an institutional memory, because international institutions cannot work without a shared institutional memory, a shared vision and documentation even of what happened in the past, because that is the basis of their future action, the precedents. So I believe that the existence of international institutions, including the European Union, which is not an international institution, but still of that supranational layer of institutional decision-making, I think this will help us keeping and developing a collective memory at institutional level of what has meant a crisis and how to retain the lessons to address this crisis, similar crisis in the future. What I'm more worried about is the collective public opinion memory. On that, I am not sure about how well we will manage to preserve it or cultivate it. Why? Because on one side, time has brought us, as I said, this extra layer of supranational institutions that I believe will help us on an institutional level to have this collective memory preserved. But on the other side, the global public opinion dynamic has grown much faster. And the rhythm at which the news cycle renovates itself is super fast. A news of this morning, 10 o'clock a.m. on Monday, is already old. This evening, 7 p.m., the same day. The news cycle is going very fast. And I think that this will create somehow a sort of diversion of perceptions. And you see it already now in society. You see after 1 year and a few months of semi-lockdowns, complete lockdowns, still it's more than 1 year that we are struggling with a very sad and atypical situation, you see it already now. Individual reactions to the openings are very different. There are people that go out and party as if nothing happens, and people that still stay at home even if they can go out because they have been so much afraid that still they would take some time to go back to some form of normal social activities. So I have the impression that we will have somehow 3 layers. Individual behaviors very much determined by the individual experience in a solitary bubble, depending on how hard you have been hit by the situation. Then an intermediate level of institutions, an upper level of institutions, nationally or internationally, that would preserve the collective memory of what it has meant and the lessons to be learned. And then in between, I think we will have a global public opinion that would rather be quite lost. And I don't know how we will manage to connect the 3 layers. That I think will be quite a challenging exercise for political decision.
I do think that there is, another challenge on this field, and it will be, also a political decision really to build up a shared memory of what happened, as it happened for other, phenomenon that affected the humankind. So thank you very much for these very interesting answers. I will ask another question and immediately then leave the floor to the students, who are the most important part also of the Spring School. So I kindly ask to students to book their time for comments or questions through the chat, as we are used to do in ordinary lesson. And the last point I would like to raise, because I had many, but we didn't have enough time, so is a matter of perception. Because actually, if we look back to history, the EEC first, and then the EU looked as an important reference point. Let's take, for example, the Eastern countries during the post-communist transition, or also two Mediterranean countries more recently. So I think that in the recent past, we can reasonably say that the EU already has a global role, already plays this global role, both from an economic and diplomatic standpoint. However, this is my personal impression. So our, as European perception is different. So do you think that the European public opinion and to a certain extent also the media undervalue the true makings of the EU? And if this is the case, why there is this kind of undervaluation of what we really are in the global stage?
I have to say that I always thought that I was privileged, not only because I served in probably the most interesting position in the European institutions, that of the High Representative, but also because in times of crisis for the European Union, because when I served, it was between 2014 and 2019, and we had a sequence of crises and self-perceived crises that were very dramatic. As I said, the economic and financial crisis, the refugee crisis, terrorist attacks on European soil. It was the Brexit, the Trump administration was somehow also perceived as a crisis in Europe. So it was quite a sequence of crises. I always thought I was privileged because I was having the opportunity to see across this crisis, to see the European Union through the eyes of our partners outside of the European Union. And so I could measure the distance between the self-perception of Europeans, and that was a self-perception of a continent in crisis, and the perception that our partners out there had and have about the European Union, that was still the best place to be on earth. And if you think of it, even with all the crises we've gone through, from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, from a human rights point of view, from a cultural point of view, you have, from a security point of view, still, Europe is still the best place to be in the world. And this distance between the self-perception of Europeans and the perception that others had and have of the European continent helped me somehow realizing that, yes, we go through crisis, but sometimes we give for granted the positive things we still have. Sometimes you realize the positive things you have only when you lose them. And this is a natural human attitude, but a dangerous one politically, because then you risk losing things simply because you start giving attention to them and giving them for granted. So I think that indeed, Europeans sometimes underestimate the treasure they have. Again, this is not to say that everything is perfect, far from. I think many things will need to change in Europe, and many things don't go well. But compared to the rest of the world, there's quite a significant distance. There is one saying in Italy, in Umbria, I think in particular. I would say it in Italian, and maybe most of the students will understand it. And it says, "Poco se mi considero, molto se mi comparo." I feel I am a little thing if I consider myself, but I'm a big thing if I compare myself to others. That has nothing to do with self pride. It's more to do with the objective conditions we have in Europe. And again, sometimes we give for granted, but we have a welfare state, we have economic situation, we have social rights, economic rights, human rights that are non-existing in any other parts of the world. Maybe Canada can come close, and that is the only place in the world. Even in the United States that we love and we take as a model, still it's a country with no parental leave, no public health system, death penalty, serious challenges in terms of social divisions on an ethnic background. So here again, I think that we have, sometimes we underestimate the achievements we've built in the past.
Thank you very much for this interesting answer. I immediately leave the floor to the students, so because I think that they will have many questions to you. So I kindly ask to Georgi and Terek to ask, the book. Okay, we have here the perfect technical management of question time. So Georgi, please.
Thank you, Ms. Lomellini. Of course, I would like first to thank Ms. Mogherini for this lovely contribution. Actually, my question is related to the EU global strategy that was proposed in 2016. So we have experienced major geopolitical shifts so far, but also in terms of priorities within the European Union, many things have changed. So my question would be, is the idea that was embraced in 2016 still on the table, and what has been accomplished so far in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. And I have to say, my students also often ask this question, especially in these last months. Yeah, I think not only, well, first of all, I think personally, but also the European Council has confirmed that the global strategy is still the strategy of reference for the Union. So it has been confirmed as the strategic document guiding the work of the European Union. It will be complemented by a strategic compass on which member states and European institutions are working now. And that should be ready in its first draft in November. So I would expect that this would be publicly out, yes, in the coming 5 to 6 months. But that is not a global strategy. That is not a security strategy or a global strategy. That is more of a common analysis of the sense of direction of global trends. So the intention is with that global compass, strategic compass, to develop common understanding, common strategic culture across the European Union, which is different than a policy document like the global strategy. So the global strategy is, both in my opinion and most importantly in the decisions of the European institutions, still the strategic document of the European Union. I think I read it again recently for preparing a conference, and it really indeed still contains all the major strategic guidelines that the European Union can apply today. It even refers to importance of the global action on health sector. So it had some forecasts that are still very much valid. There is an important work on the implementation side. Obviously, every strategy, and especially that kind of strategy that was always intended to be an implementable document, not just a paper. Everything lies in the implementation. Of that strategy, I would say the part related to defense and security was very well implemented and very fast implemented, and now needs to be sustained over time, which I think will continue, maybe slowing down a bit, but I think I'm confident that the implementation part on security and defense of the global strategy will continue and be sustained, or the entire work on strategic autonomy and the capability development and so on and so forth. The part on the civilian and military coordination also, I think, has been well put in place. There is one part that is for me essential. Well, obviously, the entire philosophy, the two pillars, I would say, of the philosophy of the global strategy. On one side, the investment in partnerships is there and is very much valid and very much implemented, including the empowerment of partners and the empowerment of regional organizations beyond Europe, which I think is essential. The multilateral organizations, the international institutions, and so on and so forth. That I think is there and is going to stay. Then the other pillar was somehow looking inside the European Union and saying we need to put a little bit more of synergy into the different strands of policies we have. And so coordination and breaking up the silos approach was essential. And on this, we did a lot of efforts. I think we obtained some important results. Personally, one of for me, the most important legacies I might have left behind is the coordination of all the different commissioners with different portfolios on the external action, because any commissioner has a potential role in external action, no one excluded. But that kind of mechanism, connecting the different institutions and the different pillars of work, that we advanced a lot during the years 2017, 2019. I'm a little bit worried that that is not as much implemented as it was during those years now. And I guess that's also this entire impact of the pandemic and the way we work might have very practically affected that. Because working at distance is not easy. Starting at distance is not easy, but also working at distance in the institutions is not easy. And in my experience, now it's something very basic, but I think it's also valuable if I can share with you some basic elements. Sometimes the difference can be done by the fact that you have the cabinet members of different commissioners getting to chat over a proposal at the coffee machine. There's the informal side of the institutional work that has disappeared since more than 1 month, a year. And that has an impact, I think, on the level of trust and cooperative work that is done in the institutions. And on that side, I see a backlash compared to the years when I was there.
Yeah, I do believe it. I do share this experience.
But sorry, last thing, if you're interested in that, my advice would be to have a look. It's extremely interesting, I find. There are annual implementation reports of the global strategy. Every year they're published. And some of them are, one, for instance, is I find sometimes even more interesting than the global strategy itself, is the one that we did 3 years after the global strategy. So it was 2019. It's really an excellent exercise because you see what was in the global strategy, what has been implemented. Some things have been implemented even far beyond what was foreseen in the global strategy. And it even identifies the tracks of work that could be looked at from that moment onwards. So if you're interested in that, I would suggest that you have a look at the implementation reports because they're really very well done.
Thank you again also for the suggestion. We have here Semia Betul Akova.
I have a question for you, and thank you to this knowledgeable speech. First of all, I'm from Turkey. That's why I have a question related with the Turkey. As we know, Turkey is a very important partner with the European Union, especially to control the migration flows from the Syria to Europe. But this week, there is an initiative was launched in the European Parliament officially suspend the accession negotiation between Turkey and European Union. What do you think? How is it affect the situation between Turkey and European Union in this aspect? Thank you.
First of all, I agree with you. The partnership between the European Union and Turkey is a very important one. And I would say not only for the management of the refugee crisis, for which I always remind everybody, Turkey is hosting a large number of refugees on its soil in a way that sometimes we tend to forget. And not only in the camps, but also in the local communities and villages, which is something important and not to be given for granted, as well as Jordan is, and with the support, obviously, of the European Union. So it's not, sometimes in Europe, we only see this through the lenses of the prevention of flows into Europe. I believe personally that what is most important is the management of the life of refugees, wherever they are. That is the point. That is a humanitarian duty, and I think also self-interest of the European Union to make sure that human beings are first of all safe and get education and life. So this is one part of the importance of the partnership, but I think that also the partnership with Turkey is important when it comes to regional dynamics. Turkey is an important regional player, and not on everything, the European Union and Turkey have the same positions, to put it mildly, but it's an important NATO ally, it's an important player, and in some crises, in some cases, also a like-minded player, not in all, but in some, yes. So I think that from a geopolitical point of view, from a foreign policy point of view, from a regional point of view, it is very important that this partnership is kept. And there are clear divergences between the European Union and Turkey that have grown deeper in this last 5-6 years in quite a dramatic manner. And to me, they concern mainly rule of law, human rights and democracy standards inside Turkey. And I think that this will be, I think this is the real element of difficulty that we're facing today. And I do not have, I do not think that it will be easy to overcome these difficulties in the near future. I think it will depend a lot on internal developments in Turkey. While on the other side, personally, I've always been convinced that the crisis in Cyprus is one that can be solved if political will is there. I don't see this as an impossible solution to be found. I think the point there is having enough motivation and political will to find a way forward. And I'm confident that this can be done. The main obstacle I see today is, yes, it is the internal situation in Turkey, the internal developments. And this is why I believe that this should not prevent Turkey and the European Union from finding other channels of cooperation, coordination, and communication on issues on which it is vital that they cooperate and they work together. I hope this answers your question. It's a complex and wide question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also, Semia. And now we have Sara Testaferri.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lomellini, and thank you, Professor Mogherini, for this opportunity. Here's my question. As you mentioned, the European Union is involved in several civil but also military missions. There exist troops and military working under the European flag, but it looks as if talking about a European army is a taboo. Why? And wouldn't it be a necessary fulfillment of the defense integration and crisis management potential? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for this question. I can tell you my personal opinion about that, and you'll probably get a different answer if others were responding to that. Personally, I have always thought that talking about the European army could be counterproductive in terms of achieving concrete, immediate steps on the European defense today. Why am I saying so? Because the Lisbon Treaty already contains a lot of instruments that allow much more integrated and deeper defense work at the European Union level. Some of them have been activated this last 3-4 years. Permanent structured cooperation, a common, a joint command for the missions, for instance, coordination of defense budgets among member states, more cooperation with NATO. Several different instruments have been put in place. There are some other instruments that are present in the treaty that have not been explored yet. And I believe that is the real way to go. If you want to continue to increase and deepen European defense, for instance, the activation of battle groups is something that has never been done, and it would be a positive step forward. It has never been done for budgetary reasons, but I think this is the way to go. The European Defence Fund has been created, the European facility, the European Peace Facility has been activated, which is going to fasten much more the resource allocation for military operations and also equipment. So there is a lot that we can do still within the existing institutional framework. And if this is not done, is either because of lack of political will or because of lack of political focus, that other priorities are put first. So my impression has always been that focusing on a European army that is a far away and definitely very challenging objective to achieve could distract from achieving what is possible to be achieved tomorrow, and even scare some of the member states or the partners that would see in a future European army a threat to their own national defense. So I've always, the way in which I approach the work on European defense has always been this. Let's not talk about what will happen 10, 20 years from now. Let's talk about what we can do tomorrow. And that worked. Somehow that worked. Personally, I have my doubts that a European army would work, because one army, as you said, in terms of military operations, we are working already together. There's a fourth generation that is done together. The command is joint. The flag is one. The uniforms are different, but the flag is one. The chain of command is one. The mandate is one. The political control and guidance is one. Everything is European. The only thing that is national is the uniform that different men and women wear, because that identifies their national backgrounds, but it's purely European. A European army, in real terms, if you imagine that, would mean that you would not have an Italian army, a French army, a German army, a Polish army, a Greek army anymore. You would not have a minister of defense. You would not have a chief of defense. You would not have a general or an admiral on a national level. You would only have a European structure. Now, not even NATO has that. Not even NATO has that. And the European Union is not a military alliance. It is a political integration process. So I'm wondering whether we need it. And I'm wondering whether it is at all possible, not to talk about the fact that we have different national identities on the field of defense. We have neutral countries. We have Ireland. We have Austria, and we have France that has a nuclear weapon. Are we really imagining that one army at the European level with one minister and one chief of staff would be realistic to achieve? Would French general be commanded by an Irish chief of defense? I wonder if this is realistic to imagine. What is realistic to imagine is that we do more operations together, we do more fourth generation fast, and that we activate the battle groups that are indeed the operational part of an army. And sometimes I even had the impression that talking about something unrealistic in the very far future was somehow an excuse or a cover not to do what is possible to be done in the
Thank you very much for this answer. We'll steal a few moments if you are still available, because we got several.
I will have to leave in 15 minutes from now because I have another call afterwards.
Definitely,
but 15 minutes, I'm all yours, absolutely.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one question more. So we have here Leonardo Daziani.
Thank you, Professor Rumellini, for the opportunity, and thank you so much, Rector Mogherini, for the very insightful speech you gave. And yeah, my question probably has much to do with something you have already mentioned and also my fellow colleagues have already treated. And so being aware of your key role in the establishment and development of the PESCO, and yeah, taking advantage of this transitional period between the recently concluded first phase and the one that will run from this year to 2025, I would like to ask you if it's possible to take stock of what has been achieved so far and what you expect to emerge from the proposal that will be submitted by the end of June. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do you want to take a second one and I try to answer to two so that we give extra space?
Availability.
Because I tend to be very long in the answers, and this is sometimes...
Actually, also questions and topics are very complex indeed, so you are... so maybe Arthur O'Connor is ready to ask a question. I'm asking to the person in charge of managing. Okay, so...
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mogherini. My question to you was that nations within the EU are under significant threat from Russian influence operations, perhaps more than ever, following the Cold War, and of which Brexit and the rise of right-wing populism can be seen as a part of. How can the EU seek to regain balance, and how might this strategy involve or not involve the United Kingdom following Brexit? Thank you.
Yes, yeah, indeed, two complex questions. I try to answer in less than 10 minutes. First of all, Leonardo, yes, indeed, I think this is the right moment to take stock, see what kind of expectations have been met in this first phase and what is left behind somehow, which are the gaps that still need to be looked at, and try to, I would say, direct strategically the next steps of the PESCO implementation, so that it is not left to a sort of random choice by member states. Why am I saying this? Because, as you know, the PESCO projects cover a different variety of sectors, one very different from the other. And the first phase was basically welcoming almost all kinds of projects, because initially we had to test the waters and see what was the appetite of member states, and also how we could match some of the strategic needs. So it was a mix of leaving it as broad as possible to encourage ownership and broad participation of member states, but also focusing on some strategic assets that we felt were absolutely a must. And I mentioned here, for instance, military mobility, because of the relevance it has with for the cooperation with NATO. So a mix. I think that in the second phase, obviously, there will need to be a more strategic selection or direction given to the kind of projects that will be supported. My impression, my personal expectation would be to find a balance between the inclusive approach that has been taken so far, almost exclusively inclusive approach that has been taken so far, making sure that no member state participating in PESCO feels that it is not relevant to the entire process. And I remember very well, this was an obsession for some member states. And it was important to show that PESCO projects could also cover some niche elements to make sure that not only the big industries had their part in it. So it's not only drones, it's also cyber, to give an example. But also, and mainly, I think there will be a need to keep one element one part of this inclusivity approach that makes it relevant for all member states to be there. But I would expect that the next phase will determine some more specific strategic trends, let's put it this way, and namely the capability gaps, how to address those. I think that would, personally, I think the added value of PESCO in the mid-long run would be that of using the European Union incentives, including the economic ones, to have European industrial projects that address the key strategic capability gaps that Europe is facing. That is, to me, the main point. So I would actually expect personally more focus on capabilities than on the rest. But that is a personal expectation I have. But I would say realistically, I think there will have to be this match of keeping the inclusivity side, so some niche plus some big impact projects, together with a clearer streamline of what is the strategic capability gap that needs to be addressed. And it's a long process. I was having a conversation with some NATO colleagues and friends the other day, and you realize to develop serious capabilities on industrial level, it needs decades. It needs research and sometimes dual use, and it's not a process that you do in 1, 2, 5 years. Sometimes you do it in 20 years. So I think a little bit of strategic patience will also be needed. On the second question, I'm afraid you would need, you will have probably the rest of the sessions because it covers actually all the many different aspects of the crisis management. But I would say a few words about the UK and how I believe the European Union and the UK can, could, should coordinate and cooperate on the crisis managements, different crisis managements we have in front of us. I share with you a personal viewpoint and a personal also experience. I have been chairing the council in different formations, foreign ministers, defense ministers, development ministers. I've been participating to all the European councils with heads of state and government. I've always, and my foreign minister of the UK has been Boris Johnson for a while. So I've seen, and also Philip Hammond. So I've seen all of it, I think. I have to say, I never had any difficulty in working neither on foreign security nor defense policies of the European Union with any of the UK ministers, including Boris Johnson. And if you think of PESCO, for instance, and all the work we've done on defense, we've done it by unanimity after the Brexit referendum, with the UK still in. It was all done at 28. I left still with 28 member states. And all decisions were taken unanimously. And yet they were all taken. I never had one problem of lack of unanimity of any foreign policy or security policy decision in the country during my 5 years. Never once. This to say, and even more, there was one real game changer we introduced during my mandate, for which the UK was actively pushing and contributing. And that was that we established the coordination of the EU member states at the Security Council in New York. And that was at the initial initiative of the UK. It was very much pushing for it. So I think, I'm convinced actually that the UK has an interest in coordinating, has a strategic interest, probably not a short-term communication interest, but a long-term strategic real interest in coordinating and sharing foreign and security policy with the European Union much more than it shows. And I think that at a certain moment, I hope that at a certain moment, the rhetoric will fade away and the substance will emerge. Because I do not see any foreign policy issue. I see a lot of trade issues, but I don't see any foreign policy or security policy issues on which the UK and the European Union are drafted apart. Not one. Not one. From Russia to the Middle East, not one. I see a lot of trade irritants. I see a lot of other things, but on foreign and security policy and defense, on top of that, there's the EU-NATO cooperation that is stronger than ever. So I don't really, that's now the US-EU cooperation that is going to be relaunched and boosted. So I really see this as of all the fields of potential conflict, friction, or partnership, foreign security and defense policy, I think, is the most positive one to be explored between the European Union and I've always been convinced of that, because there is a joint interest in doing so. But we will need we will need the heat of the rhetoric to fade away. We need to be a bit patient. But I'm sure on the European Union side, the door will be open for this kind of cooperation, but at all multilateral levels.
Very interesting indeed, also this inner perspective, I would say. So thank you very much for your availability, for your scientific assessment, and also for sharing your professional experience with us, because it is very interesting indeed. And I'm sure that provided key precious hints that would be discussed in the following session. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I wish you all the best for the continuation of the school, and hope to see you somehow in person next
Definitely,
year.
we will wait for you here in Padova. So thank you very much, Dr. Mogherini, and goodbye.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, you too. And we are waiting for the next session that we start as planned at 3 p.m. this afternoon. We will have the second keynote speaker, Professor Bruce Hoffman from the Georgetown University. Thank you again, and see you then.